Okay, so have you ever had one of those moments where a tiny little worry just snowballs? It starts small and then bam, suddenly it's a full-blown catastrophe in your head. Well, that mental habit actually has a name. It's called catastrophizing. And today, we're going to dive into why our brains even do this, and maybe more importantly, what we can do to start rewiring that whole response.
Right. So picture this. You're in a meeting and your boss gives you a little bit of constructive feedback. It's not a big deal, right? Just a note for next time. But instead of just hearing the note, your mind just leaps ahead. It fast forwards to you packing up your desk, convinced your career is totally over. If that sounds even vaguely familiar, yeah, you know exactly what this feels like.
So, what's the official term for this? Well, psychologists call it a cognitive distortion, and that's a fancy way of saying it's a mental habit where our brains don't just worry, no. They take a challenge, they stick it under a microscope, and then they jump to the absolute worst possible outcome. And the kicker? They usually do it with little to no actual evidence. This isn't just being a pessimist, it's a really distressing pattern to get stuck in. So the big question is, where does a pattern like this even come from? Well, to figure that out, we actually need to look backwards. Because for a lot of us, this tendency to expect the absolute worst isn't random at all. It's often a learned response, with roots that go way, way back into our personal histories. All right, let's make this a bit more concrete with an example. Let's talk about Sarah. She's a marketing professional, 32 years old, and she is good at her job. I mean, she consistently gets amazing reviews. If you just looked at her on paper, you'd think, wow, she is absolutely crushing it. But then, one day, her manager gives her a few pointers on a presentation. Totally standard constructive stuff. But for Sarah, it feels like the world is ending. It's like the floor just drops out from under her. Her chest gets tight, her thoughts start racing, it all just spins out of control. And that internal voice, oh man, it's a classic catastrophic spiral. It doesn't say, okay, I should tweak that slide. No, it screams, I'm gonna lose my job. They'll never trust me again. I'll never recover from this. You can see how the reaction is just completely out of proportion to what actually happened. Which brings us to the big why, right? Why would a smart, competent person have such an intense, overwhelming reaction to something so normal? Well, the answer comes down to something psychologists call an emotional trigger. See, Sarah's brain isn't really just reacting to her boss in that moment. It's kind of time traveling. That feedback she's getting today, it's hitting a button, triggering an old emotional memory from her childhood. Back then, her father's critiques were harsh, and they felt final. A tiny mistake did feel like a total disaster. Her brain learned that script by heart, and now it's just replaying that same old tape in a completely new situation. And look, Sarah's story is far from unique. These are some of the most common roots. Things like past trauma, having unpredictable caregivers, or just growing up in a really chaotic environment. All of that can train a young brain to be on high alert for danger 24/7. Catastrophizing basically becomes a survival strategy. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you're always expecting the worst, nothing can sneak up on you. The only problem is, that strategy sticks around long after the actual danger is gone. Okay, but here's where it gets really fascinating. This isn't just some psychological quirk that lives in our memories. It turns out this has a real, measurable physical basis in the brain. This pattern can literally change your brain's wiring. Yeah, seriously. Studies using EEGs to look at brain connectivity show that people who tend to catastrophize have really distinct patterns of brain activity. This is so important. It is not a character flaw. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a neurobiological thing. Your brain is just physically wired to process information in a different way. And you can really see the difference here. So in a more typical brain response, you've got this nice balance between your emotion and logic centers. But in a catastrophizing brain, well, the wiring's a bit different. The emotion centers can basically hijack the logic centers. Think of it like this. The parts of your brain that handle feelings and senses get hyperconnected. And the result? Your reaction to what you think is a threat feels incredibly intense, just completely overwhelming. And this creates this really nasty feedback loop, especially when it comes to physical pain. The research is super clear on this. When you catastrophize about pain, thinking things like, oh, this is never going to end, or there's no way I can handle this, your brain actually turns up the volume on the pain signals. The fear of the pain makes the actual pain feel worse. It's wild. And it's why this can make things like chronic pain so much more difficult to deal with.
Okay, so we've talked about the what and the why, but now for the really good news, the most important part, really. Catastrophizing is a learned habit. And what does that mean? It means it can be unlearned. So let's get into the practical stuff, the toolkit you can use to start making that change.
So here are 5 steps you can start taking. First up, just notice the pattern. That's it. Just catch yourself when your thoughts spiral into those big words like always or never. Second, ground yourself. Ask yourself, okay, what actual evidence do I have that this worst case scenario is going to happen? Try to separate the facts from that old emotional memory. Third, reframe the story. Can you look at that criticism not as an attack, but maybe as a chance to learn something? Fourth, and this is a big one, get moving. Seriously, research shows that physical activity can really help reduce pain catastrophizing. And finally, number 5, seek support. You really don't have to figure this all out on your own. Therapy can be a huge help in getting to the root of these triggers and finally breaking that cycle.
And if any of this is hitting home for you, I really want you to hear this next part. Catastrophizing doesn't mean that you're overly dramatic or weak. Not at all. It's a sign that your mind is doing its absolute best to protect you. It just developed a strategy that might be a little outdated now. And honestly, just understanding that, seeing it as a misguided attempt at protection instead of some personal flaw, that's a huge first step toward teaching your brain a new way to keep you safe.
Because that's what it all comes down to. It's a learned habit, and that means you absolutely have the power to replace it. Once you start understanding your triggers and practicing these new responses, you really can shift from a story that's all about fear to one that's about resilience. So the only question left to ask yourself is, what new story are you going to teach your brain?